Ye sinners poor and needy, weak and wounded, sick and sore, Jesus ready stands to save you, full of pity, love, and power.
Welcome to the Berean Voice. I'm Randy Seaver. Today I'd like to talk to you about a comment that I made in my latest video, to which someone made a comment that I was misrepresenting Leighton Flowers when I made the statement that that Leighton must believe that God is the cosmic observer who sees what's happening and at times intervenes in the affairs of men because he has a redemptive purpose, but that God is not controlling everything that occurs in his universe. And the statement that Leighton made was that God is in control of everything, but God does not control everything that happens in his world. Now, you may have some difficulty understanding that statement, and I have some difficulty understanding the statement, if what Leighton is saying is that God does not treat us like robots or puppets so that he's pulling the strings and causing us to do everything that we do. We would wholeheartedly agree with that. I've never known a person who believed in the sovereignty of God as it is defined by monergists, who believe that God treats us like puppets or robots. There may be some hyper-Calvinists who believe that, but if you read Calvin, you're going to find that Calvin does not teach that Calvin absolutely disavows the idea that God is the one who causes people to sin. Calvin will use language like God has decreed to permit people to do certain things because he has a purpose for them. Now listen to that language carefully. God has decreed to permit certain things. The difference between our view and the synergist view, the Arminian or the provisionist view, is not that we don't believe that God permits certain things, and they do believe God permits certain things. What we believe is that God has determined to permit those things, whereas they will simply say that God permits them. There's a vast difference in those things. In other words, God doesn't just let things run, and then from time to time, when he sees that something's out of control, he intervenes to try to correct the situation. And so the statement that Leighton made is, God does not control all things, but is in control of all things. What that made me think of is a course that I took in high school back in the days when dinosaurs roamed the earth. It was a course in driver education. And we had, of course, classroom instruction. My teacher used to like to quote to us an epitaph from a tombstone of a guy named Jonathan Gray, and it went like this. Here lies the body of Jonathan Gray, who died while taking the right-of-way. He was right, dead right as he sped along, but he's just as dead as if he'd been wrong. It was a fun class, and at times we'd go out and since the teacher of that class was also the head football coach, and I was on the football team, he and I would talk about strategy and that sort of thing as I was driving. And the car in which we were riding had 2 steering wheels and had 2 brake pedals. And I can't recall whether it had 2 accelerators or not, but I know at least it had a brake pedal on the passenger side and a steering wheel. And the reason for that was that if I made a mistake and I was about to crash into another vehicle or a pole or something of that nature, he could intervene and prevent the accident. He could either use the steering wheel to turn the other direction, or he could put on the brake, or whatever he needed to do to intervene to keep me from messing up. So he was in control of that situation. But he wasn't controlling the situation. He was only intervening if something went wrong. But he did not make every move for me. I was turning the steering wheel, I was accelerating, I was braking when necessary, etc. And it seems to me that when Leighton has written and has said that God does not control everything, but is in control of everything, I think that's what he's saying. I think he's saying that, yes, God is the cosmic observer. He's watching what's happening. And when things are getting out of hand, then he intervenes and he fixes things up to make sure nothing really bad happens. But God is not in sovereign control of everything that happens in his universe. As some of you know, I used to have a horse. The horse's name was Diamante, which in Spanish means diamond. And he was a good horse. But since we're, if God wills, planning to move back to the United States, I thought it might be a good idea to sell him, so I no longer can ride him. But when I used to ride my horse, I was controlling the horse. Now, there were times that I would allow the horse, because it was my purpose to do so, I would allow the horse to have free rein. And I enjoyed when the horse would run as fast as he could. There were times that he wanted to turn to the right hand or to the left, and I wanted to go straight, and so I would either lay the reins on one side of his neck or the other, depending on which way I wanted him to go. There were those times that I'd pull back on the reins to get him to stop. But I was in control of the horse. I was controlling the horse. And that really happens, I think, with God in his creation. There are those times that God gives free rein to his creatures and permits them to perpetrate the most horrendous acts imaginable because he has a good purpose for what he has intended to permit them to do. In our last video, I think we talked about Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, where Joseph said, "As for you, you intended evil against me. But God intended it for good because he had a good purpose for it." Now, is that true of everything that happens in God's world? And I think the answer is yes. There are those times that God restrains us. There are those times that he gives us free rein because he has a purpose for what he intends for us to do. There are those times that we wish to go to the right hand or the left, and he prevents us from doing so because he wants us to go straight forward. So that God is not only in control of his universe, but God is controlling his universe. Now, does that mean, and if this is what Leighton means when he says this, I would agree with him, does that mean that God does not cause his creatures to sin? And the answer is, if that's what we mean, yes, that's what we would wholeheartedly agree on. And I think it would be wonderful if we could sit down and have a discussion and say, look, we're not saying this. And if you used to be a Calvinist for 10 years, as you claim, then you would know that we're not saying that. And therefore, you should not accuse us of believing that. Now, it seems to me, and I could be completely wrong about this, but about 20 years ago, there was a movement called New Calvinism. And it became cool to be a Calvinist. You know, you had your young, restless, and reformed types, and well, you know, I'm neither young, restless, but I am reformed. But they were young, restless, and reformed, and I think, this is only my opinion, but I think they said some really wild and reckless things because they were reckless. I think many of them became Calvinists because it was cool to be a Calvinist. Listen, I was a Calvinist when Calvinism wasn't cool. When I first became a Calvinist, I could probably count on the fingers of one hand the people I knew in the entire world that believed what I believed. And I didn't become a Calvinist by reading John Calvin. I didn't become a Calvinist by reading Calvinist literature. It took me years of careful study to ever come to the point of believing what I now believe. We used to be warned against weekend Calvinist. And a weekend Calvinist was a person who went to some Calvinistic conference and over the weekend suddenly decided he was a Calvinist. If that's your experience, don't call yourself a Calvinist until you've studied the Scriptures exegetically and come to the conclusions that you need to come to by examining pertinent passages of Scripture. Because the likelihood is, if you become a Calvinist overnight, you're going to make some wild and reckless statements. And ultimately, when confronted with something that you can't answer exegetically from the Scripture, you're going to decide you're no longer a Calvinist. Now it's become cool to say, I used to be a Calvinist, but I'm not a Calvinist anymore, and this is the reason. I've been spending a couple of days dialoguing with a young man. Well, he's not that young, but much younger than I. He's telling me that he used to be a Calvinist, and now he's rejected the whole thing. But he knows absolutely nothing about what Calvinists actually believe. He has no ability whatsoever to exegete any passage. So look, if you think you're a Calvinist, but you became a Calvinist overnight, stop claiming to be a Calvinist. Study the Scriptures. Let the Spirit of God convince you of the truth of God. And only when you have been thoroughly convinced from an exegetical study of the Scriptures based on sound hermeneutical principles, only then do you call yourself a Calvinist or say you believe in the sovereignty of God or whatever. We don't need any people out there who are making wild and reckless statements about what Calvinists believe. That's not helpful. Now, I just want to read a few passages, and I want you to draw your own conclusions. If you're here and you're not a Calvinist, you don't believe in the sovereignty of God, I want you to hear just a few things the Scripture has to say about God's control. Not just that he is in control so that he's able to put on the brake pedal if we intervene, if we mess up, so that he can kind of redeem our bad actions, but the fact that God is in control of his creation. One of my favorite verses, or one of my favorite passages, is back in the book of Isaiah. Yahweh is comparing himself to false gods. And he's upbraiding his people for having turned to idolatry and making a little g God and then worshiping that God when that God can do nothing for them. And when they cry out to that God, the God can't hear them. Listen to what he says. This is in Isaiah 46. If you have a Bible, follow along with me. He says and this, by the way, is the passage from which that great hymn, How Firm a Foundation, was based. He says to them, listen to me, O house of Jacob. This is verse 3. And all the remnant of the house of Israel, who have been upheld by me from birth. Sounds like God's in control, doesn't it? Who have been upheld by me from birth. Who have been carried from the womb. Now notice who's carrying. It is Yahweh who is doing the carrying. I've carried you from the womb. Even to your old age, I am he. And even to gray hairs, I will carry you. This is why the hymn writer said, and when hoary hairs shall their temples adorn. That's what that is. Like lambs, they shall still in my bosom be born. So God, Yahweh, is the one who's carrying them. I have made, and I will bear. Even I will carry and will deliver you. To whom will you liken me? And make me equal? And compare me, that we should be alike? In other words, he's comparing himself with these false gods. They lavish gold out of their bag. They weigh silver in the scales. They hire a goldsmith, and he makes a god. They prostrate themselves. Yes, they worship. They bear it on their shoulders. They carry it. They set it in its place. And what does it do? It stands. In other words, unless they move this God does not move. They are in control of the God. God is not in control of them. He goes on. From its place, it shall not move. Unless you move it, not going to move. Unless you make your libertarian free will decision, God is not going to do anything. God's waiting on you to move him, to do what he wants you to do, but he's not going to do anything to move you from your place. You're carrying him, he's not carrying you. I hope you understand that. If you believe in libertarian free will and you think that libertarian free will governs the world, no, God governs the world. We don't serve a God who doesn't move unless we move him. He goes on. From its place it shall not move, though one cries out to it, yet it cannot answer, nor save him out of his trouble. Remember this, and show yourselves men, he says. Recall to mind, O you transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning. Now listen, you can't declare the end from the beginning unless you exhaustively know the end from the beginning. And God exhaustively knows the end from the beginning. Declaring the end from the beginning. And from ancient times, things that are not yet done, saying, listen to it, counsel, my decree shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. How does he do that? Calling a bird of prey from the east. If he needs to call a raven to feed his prophet, he can do that. The man who executes my counsel from a far country. If he wants to send someone from one country to another to witness the gospel to one of his chosen ones, God is able to do that and does that. God uses means to accomplish his purpose. He goes on. Indeed, I have spoken it. I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it. Again, we have the decree of God. What God has determined he's going to do. And if God has determined to do something, is this God dependent on those who fashioned him from gold or silver and made a god out of him so that they might bow down and call out to him even though he can't do anything? What happens with this God that is not made with human hands? Listen to it. I have purposed it. I will also do it. If God has determined that he's going to do something, God is going to do it. He's going to accomplish it. I think of the passage back in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 35. You recall that Nebuchadnezzar has been, because of his pride and the fact that he has built a great kingdom, and he's looking at this kingdom and saying, look at what I've done. And Yahweh says, I'm going to humble you and teach you who indeed has enabled you to do everything you've done. And so he drives Nebuchadnezzar out into the field. And he makes him to eat grass like an ox, and his fingernails grow like claws, and his hair like bird's feathers. And he's there for 7 times. Who knows what that means? Perhaps 7 years, until he finally learned his lesson that the Most High, and that's what we mean when we talk about the sovereignty of God, that he is the Most High. There is no one higher than he who is able to call him into question for anything that he has done or purposed. That the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. And then Nebuchadnezzar said, and he does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one is able to hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? In other words, when God acts, no one has the right to call God into question for what he's done. In the next chapter, as you may recall, Belshazzar has brought vessels out of the temple of God in Jerusalem, and he's using them at one of his festivals. In the middle of the feast, he looks on the wall and he sees handwriting. And he doesn't understand what the handwriting is saying, and so he calls for Daniel because he knows that Daniel is able to interpret dreams. And he says to Daniel, I'll give you all this stuff if you'll just tell me what that says. And Daniel says, keep your stuff, but I'm going to interpret your dream or your vision of the handwriting on the wall. And ultimately Daniel says to him, here's the problem. The God who holds your breath in his hands and who owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Listen to that carefully. And this applies to every one of us. The God who holds your breath in his hands and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Remember what Job said back in Job 42 and verse 2? I know that you can do everything. He's talking to God. I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. He does according to his will among the inhabitants of the earth. He does according to his will in heaven. And no one can hold back his hand. You're not going to stop God from doing what he has intended to do, and no one has the right to call him into question for anything he's done. Hear what James says in chapter 4 of his epistle. Come now, you who say, we will go into such and such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wills, we shall live. And if he doesn't will, you're not even going to live. If the Lord wills, we shall do this or that. Listen, I've been writing a commentary on the book of Romans. I've been writing on Romans chapter 8 of late, and I've been just astounded at what Paul has to say there as I've thought about it again and again. One of the things Paul is talking about in that passage is that we as believers are so weak that we don't even know what we should pray for as we ought. Think about that just a little bit. Are we going to think about governing the world by our free will decision when we don't even know what we should pray for as we ought? But the Spirit makes intercession for us with unuttered or unutterable groanings. And then Paul says, he that searches the hearts, that's God. And that doesn't mean he has to search our hearts to find out what's in there. What that means is he knows what is in our hearts perfectly. He who searches the hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because he makes intercession according to the will of God. And so what the Spirit is doing, because he knows what the will of God is he is conforming our thinking and our praying to what God has determined, so that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us, and we know that if he hears us, we have the petitions that we have desired of him. It is not that we change God by our prayers, but that God, because of our weakness, changes us so that we pray in accordance with what he has determined that is best for us. Now, does that mean that everything that happens to us is going to be rosy and sweet-smelling? Or are we going to go through some horribly difficult times? And the answer is that sometimes God wills, or God has willed, that we're going to go through some horribly difficult and sorrowful times, because we could not learn the lessons we need to learn in any other way. Just today I was listening to a brother who loves the sovereignty of God talking about the fact that he has lost 3 sons and how he was deeply grieved because of that loss. But how that he trusted in the sovereignty of God and the providence of God in working out his purpose to do for him what is best for him spiritually. I found it extremely moving. There's a poem that I learned some time ago that goes like this. I walked a mile with pleasure. She chattered all the way, but left me none the wiser for all she had to say. I walked a mile with sorrow, and narrow words spoke she. But oh, the things I'll learn from her when sorrow walked with me. Listen, we need to learn to trust God in the darkest of times. Why? Because we have God's promise. And we know that all things work together for good. How do all things work together for good? Because God sometimes decides as the cosmic observer to come in and redeem the situation? Or is it because God is operative in everything that happens in our lives to bring good to us spiritually and eternally and glory to himself? The answer is, when darkness hides his lovely face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. His oath, his covenant, his blood support me in the whelming flood. When all about my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. Listen, brethren, our confidence is in the fact that God is in control. Can we always see what God's doing and say, well, I see how this worked out for my good, or how this was best for me? No. When it's a test of faith, the question why is often never answered. But listen, we trust God for his grace. I had an unusual situation. I was communicating with a realtor who's trying to sell our house, and I continued to bug her about selling and has there been any interest and so forth. And her answer to me was, you used to be a pastor. Don't you know that everything happens in God's time? And I thought, wow. What a rebuke. Listen, brethren, God has a purpose for everything that occurs. And he is in sovereign control of our lives. That doesn't mean that he causes our sin. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what Piper's saying. That's not what other Calvinists are saying. That's not what Calvin wrote. Read what they write. Don't just listen to these partial statements that are quoted on the internet. Piper doesn't mean that the Holocaust was caused by God so that God put into the heart of Hitler to do the atrocious things he did. That's not what Piper's saying. If you read Desiring God, you'll see that. If you read other websites, you're going to see that these people are not saying that at all. What we are saying is that there is nothing that happens, even the sparrow that falls to the ground does not fall to the ground without our Father. And if the sparrow doesn't fall to the ground without our Father, how do you think that God would allow anything to happen to his beloved people that he has not planned for our good and for his everlasting glory? Well, I hope you'll respond to that in the comment section if you need to. I hope it's been helpful to you. Until next time, may God richly bless you.